Welcome to Q on the Rocks. Once again, I'm your host, Robert, and today I am here with my special guest, Mitchell from the Seward House Museum. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for having me on. Real excited to be here.
All right, great. Well, we definitely are glad to have you here and learn a little bit more about what you do in the Seward House in general. But before that, as we all know, this is the time we start talking about a little bourbon. So what bourbon did you pick out for us today, Mitchell?
We decided to have some Evan Williams this evening.
All right, fantastic. Well, cheers to that.
Clink, clink.
All right. Nice choice today. Now, is there any reason why you decided on this particular whiskey bourbon?
Well, it's a classic.
It is.
And I like the classics.
All right. Well, hey, I guess you have the right job for that then, right? So you're in a classic home in Auburn, New York, with a lot of classic events and different museums and such that go on. So why don't you go ahead and start off, for people who don't know, just give us a little background about the Seward House, the museum, and Seward, and how he actually ended up to reside in Auburn.
Sure. Well, the Seward House Museum is a nonprofit here in the hometown of history in Auburn, New York. Some of our visitors think that we're a state park or a federal park, similar to the Harriet Tubman Historic Park down the street, but we're our own entity. We're a nonprofit. And our mission is to inspire curiosity and foster learning about 19th century America through the lens of the Seward family by providing unique and engaging experiences to...
Okay, wait, that's just a little too scripted right there. So I'm not going to lie, that sounded really scripted. I feel like that you read that right off the website there, but
well,
it is a good way to explain it, though. Sorry, I just had to make a little joke on that.
Well, I write a lot of grants for my job, so I write the mission a lot. I memorize the whole thing. It's a really beautiful home. It's in downtown Auburn. People who live in Auburn usually visited on school groups when they were in third or fourth grade many years ago, and now we're starting to see some generations return to the museum, so people who haven't visited in a long time are coming back. And, of course, we have a lot of out-of-town tourists. And the museum is a really special place because we focus on stories, not only local stories, but also state history stories, national history stories, and even international history. We can touch on at the Seward House Museum. So we cater to all different kinds of people that want to visit the museum and, of course, the beautiful gardens outside the museum, which yours truly helps take care of. So shameless plug there.
That's all right. I do those once in a while, so I understand. And we will actually be talking a little bit more about that later on. So Look forward to hearing more about that.
And you asked about what brought Seward to Auburn.
Yes.
Seward's actually not from Auburn. Like both of us, we're kind of outsiders, but we've settled in Auburn now. Seward was born in 1801 in Florida, New York, which is downstate in Orange County, near Goshen, about an hour and a half, 2 hours or so northwest of New York City. So he's a downstater. He was raised in Florida and went to college at Union College. Started attending school there in 1815, 1816, and graduated at the top of his class in 1820. And after graduating college, like many college graduates have done since 1820, he immediately starts looking for work. And he begins work in Goshen for a while, but isn't really happy with the work he's doing. So he takes a trip on the Erie Canal and ventures here to Auburn in the early 1820s and meets a young Frances Miller, who is the daughter of socialite Elijah Miller, who resides at what is now the Seward House Museum at 33 South Street. Miller had been in Auburn for a number of years at that point. He was the judge. He sat on the committee that constructed Auburn Prison in 1816. He builds his home on South Street in 1816 as well. So he was involved in a lot of stuff. And he also has a very successful practice here in Auburn as a lawyer. So Seward graduates college, comes here to Auburn in the early 1820s, and very much wants to be a part of this wildly successful Judge Elijah Miller's law practice. And the same time that he is encouraged to join the practice, his wandering eye catches Francis Miller's, who he had actually been introduced to a few years beforehand by his sister Cornelia. So it was kind of serendipitous. Seward moves here to Auburn looking for a job and also starts courting Francis Miller. And a year after moving here to Auburn to start work and start a relationship, Seward proposes to Francis, and the two were married in 1824. And he then does a very brave thing. He decides to move in with his father-in-law at 33 South Street, and that's where Seward would take up residence.
Now, for everyone listening, I would not recommend doing that route personally, but I guess it worked out for Seward, so maybe we were all having it a little wrong and should all think about moving in with our father-in-law. I'm not quite sure.
Well, what we say at the museum is that Elijah Miller was born in the 1770s, so by the 1820s, he's getting up there in years. So Seward probably figured that Elijah Miller wouldn't be around much longer, and he wouldn't have to live with his father-in-law very much longer.
Did that work out for him?
27 years later,
wow.
In 1851, Elijah Miller finally, I guess, if you were taking Seward's perspective on this, passes away.
Now, it's not official that Seward was waiting for his father-in-law to die. Let's just make sure that's straight. Don't want people saying, wait a second.
No, he wasn't sitting back twiddling his thumbs at all.
But it does make for an interesting story. I did not realize that. That is actually a really interesting fact to me. It's something that I couldn't imagine. I feel like it would have. Of course, if my house was that big, it might not be quite as big of a problem either, though. So there is that. Now, you did touch on briefly what you do at the museum. Mm-hmm. So why don't you go ahead and tell us what your role is, and
sure.
We'll get a little bit more into that.
So I'm the facilities manager at the Seward House right now, and a real concise way of describing my job is that I help maintain the site, the historic landscape, as it's called. And the historic landscape is not just the grounds, but also all the buildings, the collection itself. Everything on the property that is owned by the Seward House Museum is technically the historic landscape. And so I help steward the historic landscape, whether that's through maintenance and preservation, through rehabilitation projects, through restoration projects. And I've been in that position since August of 2015, so I just celebrated my 4-year mark at the Seward House Museum. I've been there in a number of capacities since 2014, so technically I've been there 5 years, but I've been working as the facilities manager for 4. And what I love most about my job is that every day is different, where I have these large overarching goals, projects that I work on day in and day out. There's these little tasks that each of the staff members also work on that kind of pull us in different directions, allow us to pivot from responsibility to responsibility. So each day is different, and that's definitely made the years go by fast, but it's an awesome place to work.
Well, it does sound like it must be pretty exciting, pretty interesting. Now, you talk about maintaining the grounds there. Mm-hmm. What research did you do or is ongoing that really helps to make sure that it's accurate to the era?
Sure. So we're actually in the middle of completing what's called a landscape treatment plan, and we have a landscape architect that specializes in historic landscapes. She's out of, her name's Karen Cowperthwaite. She's out of Connecticut, and she specializes on researching historic landscapes, picking what's called a period of interpretation, which is a common age that a lot of the historic features existed in, and bringing sites back to their period of interpretation. So that report is scheduled for completion in the early fall, so in the next month or so. And that plan will allow us to restore the gardens to its period of interpretation, which is 1870s, 1880s.
Okay.
So that if William Seward was to hop in a time machine from the 1870s and take it into 2019, or the years that we begin working on the garden, he would immediately recognize it. It'd be familiar to him. So sites like the Seward House Museum, state parks, federal parks, other private historic sites, they use these plans to help guide restoration efforts of their exteriors. And It's a process. We've been working on this landscape treatment plan for about 6 months now.
Wow.
Because there's a lot of resources to comb through. The Seward House is nationally renowned as having one of the most complete original collections of a historic house museum. And collections meaning chairs and tables and clothes, but also photographs of what the site looked like when the Sewards were living there. The earliest photographs we have are actually engravings or drawings of the site from the 1850s. Right after William Seward puts the first edition on the house. So we can take those original engravings and research them along with all of the other pictures, newspaper articles, letters that the Sewards wrote to one another through the decades that they were living there. And working with Karen Copperthwaite, we can compile a snapshot of what the gardens would have looked like when the Sewards were living there in the 1870s and 1880s, which is our period of interpretation for the outside. And this landscape treatment plan will give us a snapshot and a plan of what those gardens would have looked like. And then over the next couple of years, we'll phase in those restoration enhancements so that by the time the plan's been executed, Seward could hop in that time machine and say, I know that tree. Those beds of flowers look exactly the same as they did. And that will really enhance the stories we tell at the Seward House.
For sure.
Because Seward was, when he was here in Auburn, he was working outside. He was pruning bushes and flowers. He loved horticulture and working out in the garden. So telling that story of the gardens is just as important to us as talking about Seward's diplomatic ties during the Civil War or his role as an equal rights leader in the 19th century. So it all comes together nicely. And
so I like stories like that because it puts that human touch to a figure that we know historically or politically. So I think that's a really neat touch. Now, one thing about I'm really curious about when you're looking to restore the gardens, is there anything that you know of right now that just is no longer around that you won't be able to actually replicate?
There's two things that come to mind. There used to be, so right now on the Seward House property, we have the main house, and then we have a barn and carriage house. And we can talk more about the barn and carriage house when we get into DRI.
Okay.
But there are three main buildings on the site. Originally, there were four. And that fourth building was about halfway down the property called the Ice House. It was where, as its name implies, the family stored ice.
Mm-hmm.
A pretty good-sized structure. And around that structure was a full-size labyrinth. So if you're familiar with the size of the Seward House Gardens right now, in the 1860s, about 25% of the gardens was a labyrinth, a maze. Excuse me. And the Ice House was at the middle of it. And the Sewards talk about the labyrinth constantly in their letters. It was actually designed by one of Seward's children, Frederick, who actually designed the barn and carriage house. He was an aspiring architect. And it was a source of pride for Frederick. It was also a source of entertainment for Seward. He had many garden parties in his day since he was a successful politician. What politician is without a successful garden party, after all? And the labyrinth was always a highlight of someone's visit to the Seward Gardens. So those are two very noteworthy structures that aren't there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're a historic site, there's these standards of preservation that are handed down to historic sites from the Secretary of the Interior. They're the Secretary of the Interior's best practices for historic preservation. And some of the rules in there are pretty, I don't want to say prohibitive, but they don't allow you to do whatever you want on a historic site. And one of the principles of those best practices is that if there's a building or a structure that used to be there that isn't really in your period of interpretation, it might actually prove negligent to the historic resource to reconstruct it and force back into the environment something that's not there anymore. So where we can tell the stories of the Ice House and the Labyrinth, it might not be in the site's best interest in the future to reconstruct them exactly as they were.
Mm-hmm.
We can play around with how we tell those stories and how might we have a similar feature in the garden so that we can tell those stories. But those are two examples right there of something that's not there anymore.
Right. Do you know what the labyrinth was constructed of?
Yeah. Pole beans.
Okay.
Yep. at least once it was constructed with